Ukrainians and Russians rushed to the construction site, arriving almost together. They positioned themselves against the wall, sweat running down their foreheads, their fingers nervously on the triggers. They were two squads in a direct fight, one against the other. A battalion of the Russian armed forces, composed only of foreigners from various nations, began the fight in the villages south of Sudza. In the Kursk Oblast, a Ukrainian tank headed toward a trench under the risk of drone attacks. It fired at the Russians, trying to break the new position of the enemy Marines. It was a feast of fire in which life was consumed with every shot from a rifle or cannon. The villages in Kursk were in flames. More than 100,000 people were left homeless, and many more would become homeless because those flames were the result of the violent Russian advance against the Ukrainians, destroying homes of their own nation to take back the territory captured by Kiev. When it all began in August 2024, the government said they would be home soon. By December 2024, they still couldn't return to their homes and saw so many houses destroyed by bombs sent by their own government. The situation was not easy for these Russians. Many complained about the meager compensation for being displaced. Protests were even held, but they were considered illegal. But with almost 4 months of invasion, now they seem to have hope of at least returning to their territory. The Russians began a counteroffensive. Their reinforcement of 50,000 soldiers managed to retake almost half of the territory. That the 10,000 Ukrainians had taken. The positions of the troops shifted throughout the fighting. On the western side of the front, paratrooper regiments began to retake several positions. The 83rd Separate Air Assault Brigade and the 51st Guards Airborne Regiment were among the main ones, the main forces responsible for fighting for Snagast and Jobimovka. The 137th Airborne Regiment and the 56th Air Assault Regiment took part in the retaking of Korino, fighting alongside the 134th Air Assault Regiment, which helped advance toward Kermanovi. These areas were the most successful in the recapture of Kursk in October and November. There were fierce battles in some areas, such as the fight of the 155th Separate Marine Brigade, starting from Shevtukovka. Fighting in this and other positions. In the months it was deployed to Kursk, the 104th Air Assault Regiment also provided support in this area. The 111th Naval Infantry Brigade had been fighting in the region since the beginning. Even with so many casualties, they stayed focused despite retaking some positions with reinforcements from other troops. These weren't the only groups in this part of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and these positions weren't fixed either. The Marines of the 155th, for example, fought in Lubimovka. The other groups were also on the ground, participating in so many areas in the effort to keep the border region of Kursk under control in that territory. Leonid, a veteran of Bakhmut, former Wagner group from the Marine Corps, realized that he would have a new experience, liberating Russia from an invasion after so many decades without anyone offensively setting foot on its soil. Unlike Leonid, the Ukrainian Nazary had more experience fighting in the ring than on the battlefield. Mixed martial arts champion, he was in Kursk during the bloody events of 2024. The Ukrainians had retreated from Lubimovka. Often, their troops were withdrawn in civilian vehicles like pickup trucks. The risk was high, but they had to be quick. The proximity of the Russians made the danger even greater. The kamikaze drones were launched into the air, descending upon completely unprotected soldiers. The explosion took the lives of the men. Some were brought down as they tried to escape. Their bodies were scattered, many thrown across the asphalt. It's heard the explosions of the Russian forces in the distance. The Ukrainian was getting used to the harshness of war, if that was even possible on any level. The bombs exploding released energy over his body, which was very different from the punches in a mixed martial arts ring. There, he was a champion. But none of that made any difference against the flaming fist of a drone exploding in his face. He continued on foot along with the others across fields so long and open where danger could easily reach him. The Russian drones were vigilant. Their threat hung in the air, filming the explosion that hastened the Ukrainians' escape. He tried to check on the wounded, but there was no more hope for the men on the ground. There wasn't even time for the dignified removal of their bodies. The Kiev troops tried to cover their fleeing comrades. A kamikaze drone targeted the Russian soldiers in a civilian car. Seeing it approach, one of them tried to jump out, but was caught at the moment of the explosion. Rolling on the road, he felt the shrapnel. His body was pierced and his skin tore as it scraped the asphalt. The Russians were too close, again, Ivanovka. That's why a Ukrainian tank from the 17th Mechanized Brigade rolled down the road. He was in a trench. Days after leaving Lyubomovka, he saw the arrival of the tank, which showed up to deliver supplies to the Allied soldiers. Afterwards, the armored vehicle headed for the Feast of Death, slowly approaching the enemy infantry positions. The cannon pounded the enemy positions, with the shells saturating the space between the trees with smoke. That movement continued with the tracks, taking the tank to unleash more and more explosions against the Russian forces. There were many shots to break the strength of the enemy offensive. The Russians were taking strong positions near Ivanovka again, but so many hits from the tank almost knocked out the stronghold they had created. A tank exposed for so long was a problem. The kamikaze drone appeared, swooping down in a sphere of fire and smoke over the armor. The grayish air marked the strike, but the tank kept going. It's noticed how the front line started to get confusing due to the proximity of the forces. The Russians were very close, and the orders were to hold the defenses and wait for the right moment to counterattack, or they would be overrun. They were so close that the risk of friendly fire increased among the fighters. BTR-82A Russo drove across the field looking for his allies after dropping off his troops. He saw other Soviet-made armored vehicles ahead and moved forward to try to make contact, avoiding firing at a possible ally. He was greeted by a point-blank explosion that twisted all the metal of the vehicle. The Russian crew members still managed to jump out and run, protected by the smoke. The tank from the 17th Brigade chose not to use its machine gun to put an end to the escape across the fields. The movement of the armored vehicles had to be careful because often the Russians were prepared with their ATGMs. One of them was discovered by drones, which indicated the position of the trap so that a precise airstrike could eliminate the risk. The armored vehicles were always at risk, torn apart by the force of mines, missiles, and drones. Among the 40 CV-90 troop transport vehicles sent to the Ukrainians, one was tested against the violence of war in Kursk. One of those Swedish armored vehicles drove until it fell into one of the Russian traps. One of the Ukrainian strategies to clear the road of mines was to use drones, getting close enough to detonate them. The explosion cleared the way Kiev's vehicles to pass as they moved to defend the threatened positions. If the bombs on the ground didn't work, the Russians used a high-explosive aerial bomb, 3000, with their guidance system kits to make the bombs glide until they exploded over Ukrainian concentrations. Havlets was among those soldiers. listening to the explosion. He saw how a high-explosive aerial bomb, 3,000, gathered his comrades within a deadly area of hundreds of meters where nothing survived. When the air bombs had already destroyed their shelters, the Ukrainians tried to gather what was left to escape. But the Lancet drones came down to stop yet another escape. The Russian bombs kept searching for Ukrainian bases, lucky enough to find one belonging to drone operators. This one was hit by a devastating impact caused by a guided bomb that still managed to escape. That terror. The Russian counteroffensive was pushing them back too much, but so far Nazary Havlets was still alive, cheating death while so many comrades perished. The Ukrainians had to protect themselves using drones. It was one of their main weapons, making great strides in the war, ensuring the survival of their soldiers on the battlefield. A Russian Boyvaya Machina Desanta II, an infantry fighting vehicle, was found by one of these drones. The drone noticed that the Soviet-made armored vehicle had its hatch open and slipped in quietly, blowing up everything inside the machine. Another one of these vehicles was hit directly by another drone and became a flaming pile of metal in the middle of the road. It's received orders to march with other Ukrainian soldiers sent to stop the Russian advance. Three from Moscow dropped off several soldiers near Novo Ivanovka. The squads ended up meeting in front of a building already destroyed by Russian bombs. The exchange of AK fire began. The projectiles tore off part of the concrete, raising dust. It was covered in dust. The dust made it hard for him to aim. He understood well the risk of that close combat, so he kept shooting, even without knowing where his shots would go. It was important to maintain fire superiority, to keep the Russians' heads down. Since he was 18 years old, Nazar had been in that war. Now, at 21, he knew that this balance of forces in such close combat could very well end with most of the isolated men turned into corpses. If that happened, there might be no guarantee that his body would be taken from Kursk to be buried in his homeland, Kalush. All his parents would have would be his mixed martial arts trophies and a new medal to represent their son's death. The secret was to keep shooting, to hold the Russians in place until something changed and broke the stalemate. A mistake, an ally, or just a stroke of luck could make the difference. The Russians called for reinforcement. Those soldiers started walking between the houses to reach the building where the fighting was taking place. But the Ukrainians had their eyes on the skies. Kyiv's little aerial demons began their dives against the Russian buildings. 30 of them in the air cut off help from Moscow's soldiers. The remaining drones carefully descended into the fight between Ukrainians and Russians, entering the doors where the Kremlin's soldiers were. Listened with relief to the explosions between the opponents. The Moscow squad fled in the midst of the dust, but so many drones in the air made their escape difficult. They requested more support over the radio. With the sound of explosions in the background, bodies began to pile up and despair spread among the soldiers. In the middle of the buildings, a Russian BMP-3 arrived to assist. The cannon fired at the Ukrainians, breaking off large pieces of the walls that Nazary Havlets was using as cover. More kamikaze drones came to help solve the problem, blowing up the BMP-3. The crew got out quickly, leaving it behind. A vehicle was destroyed by the aerial threats. After this battle, the Russians realized that the Ukrainians had rearranged their defenses in Novo Ivanovka, trying to encircle more parts of the village. The vehicles brought Nazary Havlets and other men from Kyiv to occupy the houses, but they were met by drones. The soldiers tried to escape, aware that they were being watched by the night lenses. The bombing occurred with the target plane With the help of this visualization, the two S-99 began to be prepared, coming out from among the trees to prepare the ammunition and fire its 120mm mortar. The cannon could fire various types of ammunition, such as high explosive, white phosphorus, and smoke rounds, as well as laser-guided munitions like the KN-8G. Sometimes they hit directly, destroying the houses where the Ukrainian soldiers were hiding. That was one of those knocked out by the impacts, hit between the vehicles. He even tried to save himself in the middle of the burned grass, but his strength faded as his soul tried to fight against death. He ended up defeated, becoming a victim on that ground. The only consolation for the family was to give him a proper burial in his hometown. In mid-December, the Russians placed the fighters inside Ivanovka, and its liberation seemed like a matter of time. Leonid had an impressive resume in the Russian armed forces. Born in Niemen, in the Kaliningrad region, he graduated in medicine before deciding on a military career. He chose one of the military units of the Baltic Fleet, but in 2012 he was transferred to the Black Sea Fleet. He was out of the armed forces for a while until the invasion of Ukraine began. At that time, the Wagner group began mass recruitment, mainly for the capture of Bakhmut. Leonid was among the mercenaries. His previous experience was important in one of the most violent battles in the war in Ukraine. The waves of Wagner prisoners, led by men hardened by combat in Syria and African countries, defeated the Ukrainians in May 2023. After that came the fateful revolt of the mercenary leader. Leonid distanced himself from the mercenaries and signed the contract with the Ministry of Defense, becoming a lieutenant among the Marines and serving in the Northern Military District. First, he fought in Kharkiv and was deployed along with other Marine forces to retake Kursk. He had in his record the capture of Crimea, the capture of Bakhmut, and the unresolved skirmish in Kharkiv. Now, in Kursk, he needed another victory. That's why, along with his comrades, he set out for another assault against the Ukrainian forces. Drones from Ukraine's Ninety-5 Air Assault Brigade exploded against the armored vehicles. Kiev's troops had to resist the Russian advance on the northern Kursk front. The Kremlin's soldiers ran out of the destroyed vehicle. Their hearts pounded in their chests, beating harder. As they approached the drones, the first one exploded among the 155th Marines, making their bodies roll across the fields. With the open field ahead, all they could do was hide behind the trees. Like in a sadistic game, the drones kept finding them and exploding. One of the wounded was left on the ground, putting his arms in front of his head in a purely reflexive movement, which only made the fire devour and destroy his limbs. Before the shrapnel shattered his skull, Leonid made the column keep moving forward. The tactic was to push the Ukrainian defenses until they were exhausted, even with the risk of so many vehicles crowded and lined up close to each other. That was very different from the urban combat in Bakhmut or Kharkiv. Lieutenant Leonid was sending green soldiers into open fields, artillery, and Ukrainian drones. Another armored vehicle from that massive column hit a mine along the way. Some vehicles in the long convoy fired, but had no effect. Most of them were infantry transport vehicles, which took heavy hits from Ukrainian artillery. Leonid gave orders for some vehicles to take another route. The drones hunted the tanks, following the basic rule of that war, where equipment costing just a few $1,000s destroyed machines worth millions. The crew members just watched, sometimes trying to stop the aerial demons with rifle fire. Death found the Russian soldiers in the middle of the vegetation. A wounded man desperately took off his equipment. hearing the screams of his comrade ahead and desperately crying out for salvation, forgiveness, or just repentance. The drones were searching. A column of that size meant many targets scattered among the trees. The thermal camera images made the Russians stand out in the middle of the vegetation. With no place to hide, they suffered as explosives were dropped on their bodies. The shrapnel caused at least one of the white spots to be left behind, while the others ran for their lives. When they stopped to discuss which way to go, another explosive came to block their escape and put them in the same situation as their abandoned companion. They lay on the ground, groaning until the fire from the sky finally executed them. Leonid, being an officer, felt the failure of that day on his shoulders. He had hopes for that massive column and so many soldiers, but now he was starting to receive the news about the number of dead. So many faces, young recruits who had just arrived, eager to conquer the lands for their nation. The Ukrainians' hands were tending. Another point pressed by the Russians was further south, like in the village of Bork. The first Ukrainian advance troops that arrived in the village in August were brutally attacked in an ambush. Their bodies were filmed by drones. Other Ukrainian soldiers were caught by drones hiding in the houses. ETZ. The images analyzed by the Russians mapped out the main points where the artillery should strike. The bombs fell, destroying the roofs of the buildings. In the trenches, the same fire began to wipe out part of the defenses that Kyiv had taken from the Chechen forces who fled the area. A light tactical vehicle and a Cossack armored vehicle were intercepted and destroyed by Russian bombings. Without their vehicles and caught off guard by the Russians, the Ukrainian troops were hit by more bombings. Their only defense was to crouch on the ground, while shrapnel and energy swept through the air, searching for their bodies to tear apart. The Piatnashka International Brigade went into action in Bork to drive out the Ukrainians once and for all. Previously part of the Donetsk Republic, where he had fought since 2014, ended up being annexed to the 51st Combined Arms Army. The brigade was made up of international volunteers from various nationalities. Over time, the presence of British, Chinese, French, Japanese, and Serbian fighters was confirmed. His men entered Bork. For the grenades were thrown into the basements, a regular procedure in any mission to dislodge the enemies. First clashes with the Ukrainians were intense. The rifles had to be used in automatic mode to break through the positions where the enemy held out. The soldiers took advantage of the gunfire to get even closer and empty their magazines at the enemy soldiers. The empty shell casings were scattered on the village ground, while the marks of the battle remained on the trees and walls. The rocket-propelled grenade shots shattered the bucolic landscape. With the destruction and the rumble, violence spread among the houses. The destroyed walls were riddled with bullets. Bodies began to lie on the ground, while the men fought to take control of the village. Some of the fighting was very close. Men from Moscow advanced to execute the wounded enemies on the ground. Once the conflict was over, the Piatnatskaya Brigade counted their soldiers and assessed the wounded. Different troops fought in Bork, such as the 155th Marine Brigade and the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. But in the end, the Chechens showed up to make their victory videos. The Russian advances in Kursk depended on quick movement and a direct attack against Ukrainian positions. Leonid heard the news from the south and east, where the efforts were starting to pay off. Meanwhile, in the north, the Russian Marines of the 155th were still struggling against the Ukrainian 95th Brigade. Leonid met with his comrades to receive orders for another assault on the 155th defenses. He wanted to create gaps to deploy more and more soldiers into the three lines and put pressure on the 95th, while the Eastern forces did their work to strike them from the flank. The armored transport was shaken by the impact of a drone. The shrapnel injured the soldiers, but many celebrated that they were still alive. The gratitude faded quickly when a mine appeared and the road ended. The drone's inefficient work. The explosive buried the Russians in the middle of metal and smoke. The road was full of mines. A Ukrainian tank showed up to finish off the Russian armored vehicles that were still able to move. And Leonid saw his hopes of victory shattered by the Ukrainians. Once again, a tank from the 2nd Assault Battalion of the 95th took advantage of the Russian mistakes to further break the morale of the Marines. A 2nd Assault Battalion 95 tank took advantage of the Russian mistakes to further break the morale of the Marines.
The cannon roared, and its storm crashed down on the enemy trenches.
Its tracks carried it across the field, getting closer and closer to the Russian Marines who were unable to protect themselves. The only smoke covering the field was from the cannon firing. No artillery, RPGs, or anti-missiles appeared to defend the trench. The tank moved back and forth, so it wouldn't be too easy a target for any defense that might appear. The explosions in the middle of the tree line claimed more Russian lives. Satisfied with the feast of death, the metal monster pulled back so it wouldn't be taken out by a drone itself.
Leonid later saw the list of dead drones.
So many messages to fathers, mothers, and wives that he would still have to write. His hand grew heavy, his heart full of frustration, and he promised that there would still be retribution for so many recruits under his command being killed. The Ukrainians would have their graves in Kursk, just like in Bakhmut. He would still prove that his story wasn't over yet. The first half of December wasn't very fruitful for the Russians in Kursk, except for the southern part. The front partially stalled, and Putin was still anxious for his Christmas present. Some good news that would finally relieve that discomfort that had been inside his country for more than 3 months. The casualties were high, even if it wasn't admitted. It was at a high cost that Russia continued the war at that level, needing to recruit at least 30,000 soldiers per month to maintain the intensity of its advances. Much more than Ukraine, with its highest estimates being 6,500 at that time, when Russia had 50,000 soldiers against 10,000 Ukrainians in Kursk. The advantage was clearly Moscow's, but having the advantage never meant an easy victory. In this way, more than 30,000 lives were offered each time as a sacrifice to the gods of war and their servants in the carnage that was about to reach 3 years.